Okay, so modern society has built increasingly powerful systems to capture your attention and lead you into a loop of instant gratification through seemingly small actions. In this loop, every positive habit is drowned out and replaced by an easy and bad alternative. For example, eating healthy is replaced by fast food delivered right to your doorstep, and meeting friends or getting to know new people is replaced by mindlessly scrolling on social media. What we often fail to consider, though, is the compounding negative effects of those little bad habits that over the long run drag down your productivity, creativity, and with them your general mental health altogether. That's why in today's video we will be going over the science of breaking those bad habits up and building new good habits in their place. So we just looked at the compounding negative effects of bad habits, but luckily it works the other way around as well. If you improve yourself by 1% each day for 1 year, by the end of that year you will be 37 times better off. As James Clear, the author of Atomic Habit, puts it, habits are the compound interest of self-improvement. The same way that your money multiplies through compound interest, the effect of your habits multiply as you repeat them. One of the main difficulties in building positive habits, however, is that the progress made by those habits is not linear and it oftentimes doesn't come quickly. You might have to delay gratification for a long time before the positive impacts becomes noticeable and helps to motivate you. For example, going to the gym 3 times a week won't result in a noticeable change in the first few weeks, but after a few months the changes will be massive. The most difficult part, however, is to stay consistent in the first few weeks when you don't see any results. So how can we do that? Well, first of all, we have to learn to focus on systems instead of goals. Because while goals are definitely not useless, they have 4 major problems. The first problem is that winners and losers actually have the same goals, meaning every applicant for a job has the goal of getting that job, but only one actually gets it, so their goal can't be the differentiating factor.
We should hire you.
Secondly, achieving a goal is only a momentary change. Imagine you have to tidy up your room. After that goal is achieved, you might feel good for a moment, but if you don't change the behavior that led to the room being dirty in the first place, the achievement of the goal was ultimately meaningless. Thirdly, your goals actually restrict your happiness. That is because you postpone your happiness until you reach that goal, which makes happiness something that only your future self is allowed to enjoy. And lastly, goals are actually at odds with long-term progress. That's because if you're only motivated in anticipation of a goal, your motivation will completely fade away once that goal is reached. However, James Clear does not make the point that goals are completely useless, but that you don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. So now that we clarified the importance of systems relative to goals, it is time to complete the picture by going into the deepest layer of behavioral change. Identity-based behavior. Because while goals are primarily focused on outcomes, which is rather superficial and easily neglected, and systems focus on processes, which are more resilient but difficult to set up, identity-based habits are almost unstoppable once they are built up. When you identify yourself as an intellectual figure, for example, you will become intrinsically motivated to read books and it will become second nature to you.
Well, my brother has his sword, and I have my mind, and the mind needs books like a sword needs a whetstone. That's why I read so much Jon Snow.
On the flip side of the coin, if you're convinced that you as a person are just not a reader, no goals or processes will push you to read consistently. Of course, a positive identity isn't built quickly, but according to James Clear, there are really only 2 steps you need to take. First, decide the type of person you want to be, and second, prove it to yourself with small wins. And as you probably guessed by now, these small wins are best achieved through habits, which finally leads us to the science of how habits actually work. And this science is surprisingly easy to understand with the concept of the habit loop, which works like this. Every habit starts with a cue which triggers a craving. This craving in turn demands a response, which will grant a reward. Over time, the reward will be tied to the cue and the habit loop is complete. Sounds a little abstract, but is easily understandable with a short example from my personal life. So some time ago I started replacing excessive social media use with playing chess online. Sounds a little odd, but the reason is that it felt like a little bit more of a productive form of distraction to me that I thought was well under my control. After reading Atomic Habit though, I realized that this habit of playing chess had a clear cue in the form of anxiety resulting from a difficult task at work. And this cue triggered my craving to feel better again. The obvious response for achieving this craving was to open chess.com and queue up another round. This in turn increased my dopamine and the anxiety went away. Reward. So let's take a look at each step in this habit loop and find out what we can do to make our bad habits go away and build better habits instead. The first step towards making a habit obvious is to be aware of it. So what you can do is to build a habit scorecard where you put every habit you currently have and mark it with a plus if it's positive or a minus if it's negative. Then you can take this habit scorecard and apply a technique called habit stacking, where you link one positive habit to another. So for example, right after you go for a walk in the morning, you meditate for 5 minutes. The only thing you have to consider if you stack your habit is that the behavior should be highly specific and immediately actionable. Aside from those basic techniques, the most important thing you can consider to make a behavior obvious is to tweak your environment. You want to make sure that it is devoid of cues for undesirable behaviors, like a bag of chips or your PlayStation controller, and filled with cues for desirable behaviors, like books or a yoga mat. Additionally, you can split your room into so-called activity zones that allow the context of your environment to cue you into the right behavior. And even if you're in a small apartment, you can designate your desk to working, your couch to reading, and your bed to sleeping. Designing your environment like that really is the best way to make a habit as obvious as possible. So in order to understand what drives the attractiveness of a behavior, we will have to take a look into some basics of the neural modulator dopamine. Broadly speaking, dopamine determines how much we crave or desire something, which intrinsically links it towards habits. In fact, every behavior that is highly habit-forming, from taking drugs to eating junk food, is associated with higher levels of dopamine. More specifically, dopamine is released when you experience pleasure, but even more importantly, when you anticipate pleasure. Gambling addicts, for example, get the highest increase in dopamine right after placing a bet, not after winning the bet. That means if you want to increase your craving for a behavior, you also need to increase the dopamine that is attached to that behavior. And you can do that by using a technique called temptation bundling, which is built on the so-called Bregman principle, which states that more probable behaviors will reinforce less probable behaviors. That means listening to music while you're jogging should increase the likelihood that you're actually going jogging, because listening to music is associated with higher levels of dopamine. Going a bit deeper than that, the main thing you need to discover is that the basis of craving to do something is not the activity itself, but the underlying feeling it promotes. When you smoke a cigarette, for example, you don't really crave to smoke a cigarette, you crave the feeling of relief. And when you're going on Instagram, you don't crave the process of mindlessly scrolling, but the feeling of social belonging. Therefore, if you want to feel craving for engaging in a hard habit like going to the gym, you have to reframe your mind by associating this activity with the positive feeling it gets you. And if you want to stop craving an undesirable behavior, you have to spot the underlying feeling it promotes and get that feeling elsewhere. A teacher of film and photography in the University of Florida divided the students into two groups, a quality group and a quantity group. Like the name suggests, the quality group was graded for the quality of photos they took, while the quantity group was graded for the number of photos they took. Surprisingly though, at the end of the semester, the teacher discovered that all the best photos were produced by the quantity group, not the quality group. This simple anecdote points towards the most important part for making your behavior easy, to get your repetitions in. Because it is easy to become so immersed in trying to find the optimal plan for changing behavior that you never actually change anything in real life. This is referred to as the difference between action and motion. While actions are actually delivering outcomes, motion makes us feel like we are making progress, just without the risk of failure. Or as James Clear puts it, when preparation becomes a form of procrastination, you need to change something. And that something is to repeat your desired habit until you cross the so-called habit line. Simply put, the habit line is the point where you repeated a behavior so often that your unconscious mind takes over and you can engage in the behavior without the need to think about it. And the best way to get your repetition in and cross the habit line is to use my favorite technique from Atomic Habits called the 2-minute rule. The 2-minute rule states that if you start a new habit, it should take less than 2 minutes to do so. And while it might sound next to impossible, you will find that you can scale any habit down to a 2-minute version. Reading a book before bed becomes reading a page before bed, running 3 miles becomes running once around the block, and getting ripped becomes doing 20 push-ups. After you make your new habits as easy as possible with this rule, you standardize it by getting your repetitions in, and then you optimize it by scaling it up. The only way to make a new habit even easier is to use what is called a commitment device, or Ulysses Pact, which is a choice you make in the present that directly affects your behavior in the future. This can be used to instantly start a new habit, for example by buying new running shoes which will nudge you towards running, but it is even more effective in ending bad habits. And the best example here is to end your bad habit of social media usage by deleting the app on your phone. Sometimes that's all it takes. It may sound simplistic, but the harder you make it for yourself to engage in undesirable behaviors, the less likely you will do so. Okay, so when it comes to making a behavior satisfying, the most important factor is that it has to be immediately rewarding. A great recent example of this rule are vapes. Smoking a cigarette doesn't really taste that great for most people, but adding some sweet flavor to it makes it immediately rewarding and even more addicting. The reason why this is so important is a phenomenon which behavioral economists call time inconsistency, which describes the tendency to value the present more than the future. And time inconsistency is really problematic for building habits because the rewards of good habits are usually in the future, while the negative sensation is in the present, while the reward of bad habits is usually in the present, while the punishment is in the future. So how do we counteract this psychological advantage of bad habits? Well, the main thing we need to learn is to reinforce our positive habits. One example for me personally would be to watch some YouTube right after going for a long run, because that's something I really enjoy, which makes it feel rewarding. However, I quickly learned not to go overboard with these sorts of external reinforcements, because it paradoxically made the activity itself less satisfying, because all of the satisfaction was attached to the reward afterwards. That's why today I prefer a little bit more of a timid version of reinforcing my positive habits by simply tracking them. I'm just making a sort of habit calendar with some positive habits like running or cold exposure and just making a check mark after completing them, which I gotta say is an oddly satisfying thing to do. So if you want to make a habit out of watching educational videos like this one, subscribe to my channel and leave a like. It would really mean the world to me.